Good morning, lovelies. Today we are talking about the difference between the high fantasy genre and the medieval fantasy genre. We're also going to see how many times I can fit the words fantasy and genre in the same sentence. Before we get started, remember to subscribe to the channel for more videos on science fiction, fantasy, and horror through a feminist lens. The book giveaway is still going on, so check out that link in the description if you want some free books. And if you can, come join these marvelous people on my Patreon community. We have a Discord server where we geek out about books, movies, and TV shows. It's great. Check out that link in the description. Okay, so I talked about high fantasy, aka epic fantasy, in an earlier What's the Difference video, where I compared it to low fantasy. So I'm going to do a quick recap here. Basically, high fantasy is any fantasy story that takes place in a world other than Earth, as opposed to low fantasy, which is basically our Earth plus magic. In high fantasy, the author has to create an entire world separate from our own from the ground up. The geography, the countries, the cultures, they're all going to be different from our own. Now, this is a very daunting task. I speak from experience. And so most of the time, authors draw from historical cultures that actually existed on our Earth as a sort of starting point. And traditionally, authors, especially white authors, pulled from medieval Europe, and this created the medieval fantasy genre. Medieval fantasy is therefore a subgenre within high fantasy, where the high fantasy world in question is based off of medieval Europe. There will be a king and a queen, nobility, knights, peasants, probably a dragon or two, and maybe some sorcerers running around to give us that magical flair. Basically, the culture and technology are going to be very reminiscent of medieval Europe. So that is any European country from usually around 800 to the Renaissance, so 1500s. You won't find any smartphones in the medieval fantasy world, but you might find a shiny sword that names you the next king of the land. This subgenre started with fairy tales, which usually take place in some magical, ill-defined kingdom never before seen on Earth, and then it got rocketed into the mainstream media with King Arthur and Lord of the Rings. Medieval fantasy is a setting, not a story type, which means almost any type of story can take place in a medieval fantasy book, from the grimdark Game of Thrones and Witcher, to romanticized sword and sorcery, to children's fairy tales. Medieval fantasy stories are all high fantasy, but not all high fantasy stories are medieval. Because medieval fantasy is so common, one could say it helped define the high fantasy genre as a whole. A lot of authors think that if they want to write any high fantasy story, they have to go medieval Europe. But they don't. The only requirement you need for a high fantasy story is a world that's not Earth with fantasy elements like magic or dragons. That's it. A lot of authors, therefore, especially authors of color, are pulling from other cultures as inspiration for their fantasy stories. Some of my favorites include Tomi Adeyemi, who created an epic fantasy world based on various African cultures. The world of R.F. Kuang's The Poppy Warrior series is almost directly copied from Imperial China, and even though it is still pulled from Europe, C.L. Polk's The Kingston Cycle trilogy is pulled from Edwardian England, not medieval England. Honestly, a lot of readers, myself included, are getting really sick of the medieval European setting. And I know for a fact that the saturation of whiteness in these stories has turned off a lot of POC readers. They won't even go into that aisle of the bookstore anymore, which is why high fantasy worlds based on non-European cultures are growing more and more popular. People of color get to see themselves in these stories, as well as a cool fantasy version of their heritage. And white people get to see something new, as well as a much needed reminder that despite our historical efforts, we are not the center of the universe. Now, of course, there are a ton of authors out there who love medieval Europe and its complexity and intrigue, and they want to use that as the primary inspiration for their world, and that's fine. Sometimes authors can find a new spin on a super old trope and make it work. That's the basis of writing. However, there's this weird thing when it comes to medieval fantasy that causes a lot of problems in the fan community, and that's the issue of realism. Most of us aren't historians who specialized in medieval Europe, but we know the basics of the general social structure and gender rules and technology and all that jazz. And when readers pick up a book that has a fantasy world inspired by medieval Europe, they expect those elements at least to remain consistent. So authors run into problems when they try to break certain rules, like having their medieval fantasy world practice gender equity, or be supportive of the LGBTQ+ community, or or have characters of color who aren't slaves or weird foreign traders. Even something as basic as like the line of succession. Let's say in this medieval fantasy society, the crown passes to the eldest child rather than the eldest son, which is why the princess ascends to the throne rather than her younger brother. A bunch of fans are gonna accuse that story of being historically inaccurate. But here's the thing. These are fantasy stories. By definition, they are all historically inaccurate. They take place in a world that doesn't exist. There's not an ounce of historical accuracy in them. Medieval fantasy is a genre inspired by medieval Europe, yes, but that doesn't mean authors have to follow every single cultural norm and rule that happened in that time and place. If authors did incorporate every single detail of medieval Europe into their story, it'd just be a book set in medieval Europe with no magic or dragons or gods or whatever. That's not fantasy, that's historical fiction. If you want to read historical fiction, that's totally fine, just don't look for it in the fantasy aisle. An author has every right to write a world influenced by 12th century France, and then populated entirely with people of color who follow a matriarchal line rather than a patriarchal one. As long as the technology of the world is medieval, then it still fits into the genre. Swords and shields, letters instead of email, castles instead of skyscrapers, that's what really defines the genre. But readers kick up a fuss because most of the people in medieval Europe were Europeans, so having more than a handful of POCs who only exist on the fringes of the story is like a shock of, frankly, much needed cold water. Europe was trading, fighting, and globalizing with Africa and the Middle East since before the Roman Empire. The Spanish Peninsula was full-blown Muslim and controlled by Arabs until the 15th century. And while Europe was going through the literal Dark Ages at this time, the Middle East, China, parts of Africa, and several Native American groups were going through various golden ages in terms of academic, cultural, and technological growth. None of which is giving nearly as much attention as that one little tiny corner of the world where it's all white people. Seriously, if you were a man in the Middle Ages, you wanted to be in China for the standard of living alone. And if you were a woman, you wanted to be Norse because Norse women had a ton of autonomy and political power for the standard of the time. And just in case you needed the reminder, Norway is in Europe. If you want historical accuracy in your medieval European story, you need to inject a lot more people of color and female autonomy than what you're currently getting. But that doesn't gel with what modern day readers think medieval Europe was like, which has arguably more power than what is actually historically accurate. And this is the reason that I think the medieval fantasy genre is dying. Authors don't want to piss off their fans by being inaccurate, so they adhere as closely to real medieval Europe, or at least what our contemporary whitewashed version of it is, as they can while adding fantasy elements. But since this is what every medieval fantasy writer has done since Tolkien, readers get bored and lose interest. They won't even pick up the book, and if they're feminists like me, they're gonna be like, where the hell are all the women autonomy and people of color and people who are disabled and LGBTQ? So writers try to spice things up with those types of characters, and then they get chewed up by their other readers for being inaccurate and daring to do things like create women soldiers or a king with dark skin. So writers stop writing medieval fantasy, instead choosing a different genre that is way less of a time bomb, and readers stop reading medieval fantasy because they see it as tropey and overdone. And why don't authors try anything new? I personally am one of those readers who loves high fantasy, but I avoid medieval fantasy specifically because I'm so sick of the whitewashed male-dominated model that many authors feel they have to follow. Game of Thrones was great in its heyday, so that is before season 8 and probably before season 7 too, and I was into it largely because it put just as much emphasis on the women as the men in this patriarchal society. But it had its flaws regarding its treatment of women, not to mention the queer and disabled communities. And as for people of color, the story's focus is almost exclusively on the very white Westeros, while almost all the people of color have to follow a white leader to get any relevance to the story. Don't even get me started on what the show did to Dorne. Jesus. Wow, this video got out of hand. Moral of the story, high fantasy stories take place in any fantasy world that's not Earth, and they're only considered medieval fantasy if that world has medieval style technology. Medieval fantasy's kind of played itself out, but there's still hope for it, assuming that all the broflakes stop bitching about minority characters being more than just props, and assuming that authors have the guts to actually go through with it. Tell me what you think of the medieval fantasy genre below in the comments. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and if you can, support this channel on Patreon. Link is in the description. Bye! Bye, lovelies!